Well, today I'd like to talk about some of the issues surrounding World War I, but these issues are ones that do not directly involve the battles. I want to take a look at some of the people's attitudes surrounding World War I and what the long-term effects, you might say socially, came from World War I. You remember when we began to speak about this, I said that many people had, what has been described as war fever. War fever. A part of this was fueled by some of the other things we've been talking about, right? Nationalism was a big one. In other words, if my nation is the best, and therefore my nation can beat your nation, right? Because we're the best. And that will play into it, that we just need to be able to go and tell people, show people how good we are. Everybody thought this war was going to be short. Everybody believed that World War I, they didn't call it World War, they didn't have a name for it yet, but they thought that this war would be like the other wars of the 19th century, and that is, it would be a war that was over quickly. It would be a very decisive war. You know, we would have a clear winner, clear loser, and we would get that done maybe in 6 months, maybe a year. But it would be like, say, the Franco-Prussian War that we talked about. Remember that one? Germany versus France, over pretty quickly. Or when Germany fought against Austria, 7 Weeks War. There have been a lot of wars like this which were pretty quickly decided, going all the way back to Napoleon, which had been 100 years before. Any sort of war or conflict fought in Europe had been fairly quick. Of course, war is never painless, but had brought gains for the victor, land, maybe wealth, certainly bragging rights. And that's what people thought. They really did. So the depictions then that you see sometimes, there are even photographs of it, of the guys in their uniforms, often see them going down to a train station now. This is how they're going off to war. Instead of marching to war, they might march down to the train station in almost a parade-like atmosphere. They parade down the main street. They go to the train station. They get on the train, and the train takes them off to war. So it is like a parade. People gather around and cheer them. All the young men marching off to war. The young ladies are all there, by the way. Smiling, kissing, hugging. Promises are made. I'll wait for you. That kind of thing. Yeah. And of course, the young men marching off to war believe they're going to be gone maybe 6 months. And when they come home, well, those ladies are going to be really impressed. Why? I'm going to have a lot of medals, right? I'm going to have a lot of war stories that I can tell, valor and honor and victory. See this medal? I got this for doing this. I got this for doing this. And the ladies are just going to swoon, and everything will be great, right? We'll have victory, we'll have advancement, we'll have honor, we'll have courage, all those things because of war. But the other wars have been wars of motion. As we mentioned somewhat last time, this war stalls out. It stalls out And instead of becoming a war of motion, it becomes a war that many have described as stagnation. It becomes a war of inches rather than miles. Why? Everything's changed. The old days of war, the Napoleonic days, let's call it that, you would have a nice, bright uniform. Maybe it's blue, maybe it's red, whatever, green, I don't know. But you have a nice uniform. You would line up on an open field. Kind of like something as big as a football field or bigger. You would line up there, and you would have your guns. There would be some cannons behind you, some artillery. You'd fire off some artillery. You would load your guns. Your guns were being loaded in the end of the barrel. That's how you had to load them. You had to put in the powder, tamp that down. You had to put in the bullet, the projectile, tamp that down. And you fire. And then, if you're going to fire again, you got to do it again. It takes time. But you could get proficient. You can maybe shoot off 1 a minute. If you could get 2 a minute, you're doing really well. Okay? And so we would line up in the field and we would fire at one another, some standing, some kneeling. We would fire off our cannons, which also we had to load the same kind of way. And they were rather short range cannons. And then eventually the order would become to charge. And we would charge across the open field, usually both sides charging at each other. They would meet in the middle. They would fight hand to hand. After they'd shot their one shot, pretty hard to load when you're down there in the middle with all these other guys on top of you, right? Plus, if you did load it, you got this rifle, and now you got to try to aim it at somebody, which is also hard. So you've had a fixed bayonet. A bayonet fixed to the end of your gun. Usually a couple feet long. Sharp, pointed. You would attack with your bayonet. Then you might have to fight hand to hand. Using a knife, perhaps. At the end of the day, there'd be a lot of dead bodies on the field. But one side would win. And that battle was over. The battles usually took 1 day. Maybe 2 days. It depends on how you count battles. But I mean, the pitched battle is usually a few hours or 1 day because that was it. And that's how we fought war. Now you take that kind of technique, which is, which did function for many years that way. But now what has happened in the past, let's say 100 years, 80 to 100 years, everything has changed, technologically speaking, but almost nothing has changed in the technique of war. Wars are still fought in the same way. The generals still think in the same way. But the weapons have changed. What do we have now? I went through that laundry list with you last time. Remember, we have landmines. Nobody had landmines in Napoleon's day. When they ran across that field, they weren't worried about stepping on a landmine. When they ran across that field, they weren't worried about barbed wire. They weren't worried about machine guns and concrete emplacements with guns that could fire off many, many rounds in a minute. 20, 30 rounds, who knows? And they could just keep firing and firing and firing. I guess until the gun started to melt, we'd have to let it cool down, right? But you just keep going. In Napoleon's day, no one had to worry about poison gas, mustard gas, where chlorine gas basically is a canister of it, let's say, is thrown or pitched or launched over on your side, and then we just let that gas escape. And as it touches your skin, it begins to burn it. It's corrosive. It's like acid. It's going to burn your skin. It's going to burn the membranes in your eyes. And then when you breathe it in, it's going to burn your lungs, your throat. You're going to suffocate. You're going to die in a very painful way. And not that quickly either. But it will incapacitate you pretty quickly. And then you'll just lie there in pain for quite a while until you basically suffocate. Terrible stuff. Poison gas, barbed wire, landmines, machine guns. What about the cannons? Well, we had cannons in Napoleon's day, but they could fire a few hundred yards, right? You had to see, you could see your enemy. You'd fire, then you'd have to adjust. Napoleon started off as an artilleryman, so he knew a lot about that. And it was good to use, but that was sort of at the beginning of the fight to break up the ranks. But now we have, if you want to call them cannons, we don't call them cannons, we call them artillery shells. These things have barrels on them that are about 20, 25 feet long. About that big around, We put giant shells in them. They're about 2-3 feet long. And we load them. We pack them with this is from the end. You put it in at the end. Put it in the shell. You put in the big packet of gunpowder. You jam it in there. You close it. Boom. Blast it off. You have a crew of 3 or 4 guys on each cannon, each artillery weapon, and they're just in the thing of loading it, aiming it, can make little adjustments to it, and then we just line those things up just so there's enough room to work in between them. About every 20, 25 feet we put another one. Huge guns. They begin to fire off shells, and we're hitting stuff we can't even see. It can go a couple of miles. Certainly a mile, depending on how you aim it. Lob it in there, right? War had changed. Why had war changed? It had changed because of the technology. People in Europe had looked to the wars in Europe to be what they thought the wars would be like in the future. One war that they didn't really look at too much was the Civil War in the United States. The Civil War in the United States didn't have all of these factors, but it had some. And it was a much more bloody, deadly war than the ones that were being fought in Europe in the 19th century. So if you want to see a kind of prototype to World War I suppose it would be the American Civil War, not the Franco-Prussian War, which is fought at about the same time. So we have the technology of the time. Telegraph, railroad, barbed wire. Barbed wire was invented on the frontier of the U.S. to keep sheep and cattle separated. But quickly people saw this could be useful in war. We can roll out barbed wire, and these guys running across a field now are going to have to try to get over barbed wire. I don't know if you've ever dealt with barbed wire much, especially big rolls of it. Not an easy thing to do. It's a painful thing to do, and you get stuck in it. Your clothes get stuck in it. You get stuck to it. Best you could do, I suppose, is if you could get something big and flat and lay on it and then try to run over the top of that. Anyway, or you take wire cutters, right? You crawl out and start cutting it, try to pull it apart. That's often was the case. Easier to carry wire cutters than it is to carry a big sheet of plywood or something with you while you're running across the field. And trench warfare. Trenches were used in World War I. There were some sort of trench things, we might call it, I wouldn't call it trench warfare, but they were using some trenches in Civil War, American Civil War. But it becomes a real commodity in World War I. And it wouldn't just be one line, like if we imagine, we're a couple hundred yards apart and you've got a trench and I got a trench. There would be a series of trenches. We would dig a trench, and then as we gain some ground and move forward, we'd dig another trench, maybe a half a mile up, maybe 500 yards up. So there was a series of trenches. So if we felt we were getting overrun in one trench, what we did? We just retreated to the next trench back. And these are just ditches. They're just earthen holes in the ground all lined up. But what would happen is instead of just being an earthen trench, they began to fortify the trenches. They put barbed wire out in front of them. They poured some concrete and put machine gun emplacements. They were up higher so they could shoot down. We put landmines out in front. Have a long network where people could go. Guys were living in these trenches for days, for months. They got an ailment, a sickness called trench mouth. Basically from the dirty conditions in the trenches. There were rats. There was, all kinds of bacteria and stuff. And they started to get their feet and their mouth started to get like fungus and other problems. Terrible stuff. But there were a network of these things, and they would run messages back and forth through them. And plan their attacks. Well, all of this had changed, and therefore World War I is going to change the war. This is why some people call it the war to end all wars, because the belief is that if and when people realized how terrible this war was, they would never fight another war. This was going to put an end to war because it was just so terrible. Huge, massive numbers of people dying, and dying in terrible ways. Well, obviously it was not the war that ended all wars. It was also called the Great War because it was the greatest war, the largest war that had ever been fought up to that time. But as the war carried on, much longer than anybody thought, it became clear that the kind of plans that we might have made for a short war of 6 months to a year are not going to work. It's going to actually begin to change not just what's out on the battlefield, but what's happening back home. You see this poster that's up here, right? Teamwork wins. Your work here makes their work over there possible. With your help, they are invincible. Without it, they are helpless. You see that? And you see then machine guns. Here's a guy building the machine gun. You see that? And here are the guys in the trenches with the machine gun using it. So basically the idea is, look, this kind of war takes money. It takes equipment. It takes machine guns, for example. Somebody's got to build those things. Somebody's got to pay for the material to make them, and presumably pay somebody to make it, and to ship it, and to get it there, and the ammunition for it. It's all expensive. So this one is encouraging you, I believe, to buy war bonds. This became another thing that they would want people to do. Basically, that means you are giving the government money. They take your cash and they give you back a piece of paper that's a war bond that basically says, in 5 years you'll get your money back with some interest. Okay? So this is above any tax monies or other things. War bonds became the way to fund the war in World War I and World War II. They were used. But notice this idea. Teamwork wins. Here's another thing that you can, another word. I think it's one of your terms. I'm trying to remember. Total war. Total war. Total war is kind of a new concept here. The United States, I think I would submit the United States has only had total war twice in our history. Now you might argue for other things, but I would say the Civil War was a total war. Everyone was involved, everyone was affected. And World War II was a total war. What do I mean by total war? That's where every single person has to get involved with the war. I'm not saying they all go and fight, but they got to be part of the team. That means, we've had a lot of wars where we do not, it doesn't affect us too much. We fought the longest war we ever fought. I guess we're still not completely out of there, is Afghanistan. But it didn't affect too many people. It didn't affect every person. You didn't have to change the way you were living because of it unless you had a relative there. Well, and certainly then you would. But most people, they still went out and bought what they wanted to buy. They still ate the food they wanted to eat. They still traveled pretty much where they wanted to travel. And most days they didn't even think about the war. Unless they had a relative there. That's not the way it was for World War II. That's not the way it was for the Civil War. These were total wars. That meant that it affected every part of your life. In World War II, here in the United States, if you wanted to buy tires for your car, you couldn't do it. If you wanted to get gasoline for your vehicle, the only way you could get it was through rationing. You'd get little points, you'd get little coupons, and you'd go to the gas station and you could only put in enough gas for which you had coupons, and you got those coupons based upon what the government felt your need was, basically to get to and from war, or to and from work, to be able to build the things for war. If you just wanted to go driving around, having a road trip, sorry. You only got so much. And if you decided you had to go somewhere, you'd have to go ask other people for their coupons, so your family members, so that you could fill up your car. Same with meat. You wanted to go to the store and buy meat. Lots of things were rationed. Meat, gasoline, tires, and so forth. Anything that was needed in the war effort. And people were asked to grow their own food. In fact, the president's wife encouraged everyone to plant a victory garden. A victory garden was a garden whereby each household was to grow some of their own food, so you didn't have to go and take the food from the store or whatever that would then would not be available for the war effort. So in other words, every single person, and people saved their bacon grease and donated it, and their tin cans and things like that. And they would take them down to places and they would take the bacon grease. You know what they made out of it? Gunpowder. explosives. Bacon grease has nitrates in it. You need nitrates to have things blow up. Well, you know, the guys that go and get the fertilizer, maybe I shouldn't tell you what they do, but they get the fertilizer. They're getting that fertilizer to get it to blow up. It blows up because the fertilizer is loaded with nitrates. Okay? Anyway, that's a total war. So that changed everything. That's what World War I is for Europe. World War I is not really a total war for the United States. We get into the war rather late, and therefore it doesn't end up affecting us as much as it does, say, England or France. So the long war is going to be a different thing. The long war is going to take much more organization than a short war. For supplies, for weapons, for food. How about uniforms, guns, all the things that you need, transportation? How about training new troops? Never thought about that. Then having to go from a voluntary enlistment to a mandatory enlistment, a draft, we would probably call it. You know, here in the United States, we still have what's called the selective service. I imagine the males in the room are familiar with that, right? Still around. Every male who's 18 has to sign up. I'm sure you do it online now, right? You used to have to go to the post office. Now you probably go to a website. Got to put your name in, your address, social security number, I'm sure. I don't know what else they ask you, probably some other things. And then you go into a database. What's that database for? Well, it's for selective service. Do we currently use it? No, we do not. But everyone must, all males must register. I'm waiting for the females to do it. Females have to register now?
I don't know. They were passing a law a couple years
Yeah.
ago. I don't know if it got passed or not, though.
I don't think so. Well, anyway, I haven't seen mass protests in the street for women's rights to be forced to sign up for selective service. That may happen someday. But so far, I think it's just males. Anyway, you can check on it. Let me know. But why do we have that? We have that so that we can immediately implement selective service, which means we select you for service. And we'd have different criteria based upon your age, your experience, and your family status. Are you married? Do you have children? There would be a prioritizing. But young, single men would be at the top of the list. Right? There can be different kinds of deferment. You know, if you're in college, that might defer you for a while, but you know, we call it the draft. We haven't used the draft, I think, since about 1973, 74, something like that. It's been a long time. 40 some years, I'd say. So our military now is all voluntary. Well, that's the way the military was at the beginning of World War I. It was voluntary. People had the war fever. They're ready to go. Sign me up. Give me a uniform. Give me a gun. Let me go out and become a hero and get medals. Let me impress the ladies. When I come home, a hero with adventures and stories. But as the war goes on, now we're going to have to begin to draft people. So what this basically means, one of the things that happens in Europe, it certainly is going to happen here in the United States as well, pretty soon after it, is we're going to have huge centralized governments. The governments will get larger and larger and more powerful. You might say, well, I don't want to sign up for selective service because I don't want to go to any war. Sorry. Government says you have to. If you don't, there will be consequences, right? I don't know what they are now. I think one of the primary things is you can't apply for any federal aid, right? Like student loans, stuff like that. So if you want to go to college, I think it also affects other things in your life. I don't know what they would do to people who did not sign up. I haven't researched that, but there would be consequences. And if they do implement a new draft and you decided you weren't going to go, you weren't going to serve even though you were requested, commanded to go, there would be consequences. What happened to people in the past is you'd go to prison. And you'd go to a federal prison. Usually pretty serious prisons they would send draft dodgers to, is what they were called. I actually had a relative who was in prison for that very reason. I won't give you any more details, but I heard stories from him, and it's pretty serious stuff. Right? Pretty serious. I'll tell you one thing he told me. He told me that he learned how to fall asleep with his eyes open because he was so scared at night. He didn't want to close his eyes, and he would actually fall asleep with his eyes open, and he'd wake up with his eyes open and they're dry. That's just one thing he told me. But we'll move on to other happy things like World War I. Well, for example, Germany in 1916, now you know where we're at now. We're in, what are we in, 2018. We are 100 years to the end of World War I. For the past 3 or 4 years, I taught a course, was it last year? The year before, I taught a course on World War I for the centennial. Been a lot of things coming out because it's been 100 years since the war. We're still in that because the war wouldn't have been over yet. Getting close though, but in 1916, Germany had 5.2 million soldiers on active duty. That's a big army. But they had planned for a short war. They had not made long-range plans. If you have to pay, outfit, move over 5 million guys around for 6 months to a year, that's one thing. But if you got to handle that for 3 or 4 years, that becomes a different story, doesn't it? Just think of the budget, right? Just think of the budget. The food. Well, how about in Britain? Britain got a volunteer army of 1 million. Can you see this poster? Private Trebto's pledge. He had almost reached his goal when a machine gun dropped him. In a pocket of his blouse, they found this pledge. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the whole war, a whole measure of the struggle depended upon me alone. You who are not called upon to die, well, you ought to buy your war bonds. Here's the idea. This guy had this in his pocket. The whole issue of the struggle depended on me alone. He gave up his life. Dropped by a machine gun. And you won't even buy a war bond. You won't even hand over, some money to help pay for things. Well, that's the idea. Fourth Liberty Loan, it's called. Well, in Great Britain, the enthusiasm began to wear off, and by 1916, they had instituted a draft. They now went from a voluntary army to a mandatory service, right? The draft. Your number would come up. That's what they used to call it. They had a lottery. This is, they got a big lottery today. I'm sure you're all going down to buy your ticket, right? You could win, what is it, $1.6 billion. That's what they say it is. And of course, when all of us go down and buy tickets, it's going to get even higher when nobody wins tonight, or whatever. But anyway, you could. It's now $1.6 billion. If nobody wins it tonight, it'll probably go over $2 billion. But here's a lottery you don't want to win, and that's the draft, the lottery. They would put your number in there. Basically, what would happen here in the United States anyway is you would get a ranking in the draft. Like I said, based upon your age, based upon your marital status, do you have children, based on, do you have any other siblings or whatever already in the war? All those things are measured in, and you are given a sort of letter and a number. And then there would be a kind of lottery where all these numbers would be. In fact, they had a draft board, a committee of people that would look over all these factors. And then they would select some out. And those would kind of go into a hopper, and then at random, this is my understanding, some would be selected. Those selected got a letter, got a telegram, got a message. Someone came to their door and said, your service is required. You are to report on Monday to camp so-and-so for your physical and for your basic training. Usually pretty fast. Within a week or two, you were there. Give you a nice haircut. Give you a drab uniform. And initiate you to military life. So they institute a draft. Another thing they're going to have to do in Great Britain, because remember, Great Britain is an island, right? It doesn't have all the materials it needs. And it's harder to get things there. It all has to come by sea. But if everywhere that you're shipping from, they used to get stuff from Germany, France, so forth. But if everything that you're getting is now cut off, you can't get access to it, it makes it harder and harder for Britain to get things. So they actually begin to abandon a free market. What do I mean by that? Well, they basically begin to set prices. We do this kind of thing here in Florida. When? When a hurricane comes. When a hurricane comes, they always make announcements. If there's some guy selling generators, alongside of the road for a big markup, turn him in. We'll come and arrest him. If he's selling you a $500 generator for $2,000, or selling you a bottle of water for $5 each,
That's Disney.
Yeah.
Shut down Disney on us. No, they'll never do that. Or a gallon of gas, gas price go way up, $10 a gallon, something like that. They'll come after them. And then the government basically says, you can't do that. Now, this is what happens during a war. Because supply, you remember we talk about the idea of supply and demand? As the demand goes up, what happens to the price? Price goes up, right? Right. If everybody in here was really hungry and I had a nice pizza up here, I started selling it by the slice. I let you bid how much I've got 8 slices here. How much you give me? I'll give you $1 a slice. I'll give you $1.50 a slice. I'll give you $2 a slice. I'll give you $5 a slice. I'm really hungry. All right. So as demand goes up, and, the longer you were locked in this room without food, the more I could get for that pizza. I suspect. So the free market is abandoned, and the government begins to set prices and wages and rent controls. They also begin to ration food and control production. Well, why wages? Why do you think wages would be fixed or controlled? What's happening during a war that might affect wages? This is what they call a pregnant pause. Well, I hope it's pregnant. I hope it gives birth to something, some discussion. Yeah, look it up, pregnant pause. Well, what happens when there's a war that might affect workers, labor?
The workers go to war.
They go to war! Exactly. If we sent off 1 million guys to war, let's say, or more, there's 1 million people that aren't working whatever they used to do. In a factory, whatever, driving trucks, I don't know what they were doing. Whatever they were doing, they're now not doing it. And so those of us who aren't over there, we still need those services. We still need somebody to run that factory or to drive that vehicle or whatever it is. So then wages could start to go up. You know what's happening now in the United States is wages are starting to rise, but they're starting to rise not through the government saying they must rise, but because lots of people are getting more jobs and people need work. And as the supply of workers goes down, guess what? The wages and the benefits go up naturally. That's what's beginning to happen. We now have more open jobs than we have people that are unemployed. The number of people who are getting unemployment is less than the number of jobs that are open. So that means that it becomes, things shift. When everybody's looking for a job, I'll tell you, you know what? Yeah, I'll give you this job, but you got to work every weekend. You got to work at night. You don't get, you get like 1 week vacation a year, and so on and so forth. But when it's the other way around, and I really need somebody to fill this job, and you come to me and say, well, I'll work for you, but I got to have 3 weeks vacation, and I can't work every weekend. I can't work every night. I'm going to need a little more money too. And the guy said, well, I really need the workers, so okay, I'll go ahead and hire you. That's how it works. So during the war like this, when you got millions, certainly thousands and thousands that are gone, people that come to take the job could begin to demand higher wages. So they say, no, wages are frozen. Whatever they were at the beginning of the war, that's what they are now through the rest of the war. Rent, same way. People have vacated, but other people are going to want to move in to work in factories that didn't used to work at those factories. So if I have an apartment building, oh, you really want this job, you're moving in, I double the rent. Or whatever, instead of $200 a month, it's now $400 a month. Prices and wages, also the prices, things that were scarce, things that are being used in the war, metals and food and things that make gunpowder and things like tires and engines, all that stuff's going to go up because we're using them. They're getting destroyed. We've got to make more and more of them. Rationing food and controlling production. All of these things then become a total war effort. That's what I'm talking about, for a total war. A total war then affects every person, not just the people in the military. The people in the military go off to fight the war wherever they're at. And unless you are probably a close relative to them, you don't hear much about it. It doesn't affect your life much. But with a total war, every single person is seen as really a soldier. We're all soldiers. Some of us go to the battlefield and fight. Some of us go to the factory and make the weapons. Some of us sacrifice gasoline, hamburgers, tires. Why? So that we can win this war. I'm rationing things. I can't buy, I'd like to go buy a new set of tires. I can't do it. Nobody will sell them to me. They're not available. Why? Because they're all being used for the war. So I got to patch those old tires and keep running with them. Well, anyway. That's a total war effort. So this is the idea that every citizen, the government will treat them like they're a soldier. Even though they're not enlisted, even though they're not in uniform, the government says, look, we are in this together. Every one of us is in this together. Therefore, everyone must make sacrifices for this war. Maybe it's food, maybe it's convenience, maybe it's a vacation, maybe it's clothing. Can't go down and buy new clothes, new shoes. Why? They're being used. All the factories that were making that kind of stuff are now making uniforms and boots for the military. You got to make do with your old shoes. Patch them up. Get out your shoe goo. You never heard of shoe goo, probably, have you? No. It used to be one of my favorite things. Shoe goo. It comes in a tube. And it's you put it on the bottom of it, like you get a hole in your sole, you put it on there, and it gets hard, gets kind of rubbery. Boom, got a shoe goo. Hole is filled. You're looking at me like I'm from another planet and a different age. Well, I guess I am. I am from another planet. I don't know where that planet is anymore, but that's where I'm from. Now, here's another thing that's going to happen. Another kind of downside is that civil liberties are going to be ignored or overlooked. What do I mean by that? You want to protest World War I? Not in Great Britain, you don't. You will be rounded up, you will be arrested, you will be charged with treason. Because we are all soldiers, you see. If you got somebody in the army who refuses to go fight, they don't just say, oh, well, you can have your protest, that's fine, you got your free speech. No, they would lock you up, they'd put you on trial. That's what happens. In Great Britain, for example, and this happened elsewhere too, they passed the Britain Defense of the Realm Act. And if you were dissenting against the war, you were considered to be a traitor. Treason. Why? Because this is a total war effort. They felt as though the entire country could be taken over. And if you're protesting that and you're harming Great Britain's chances of survival. So, this related to protesters. People marching with pickets, people doing things. It also related, of course, they didn't have Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and whatever else out there you guys are using. They didn't have that. But if they did, my guess is they would have shut those things down. You know, you can do that. I visited China a few years ago. Facebook does not work in China. Government has shut it down. It cannot be used in China. You can't, you go to log in, you can go to the thing, and it just boom, comes up with an error message. Can't use it. So it can be done. You could lock down social media in various ways just by controlling the internet that comes into a country and what goes in and out. Well, anyway, that's probably what they would have done. Why does China not want you to get on Facebook? Because they want to control what people are saying and doing and thinking. Well, in this day and age, 100 years ago, newspapers were the things. People could write columns in there, and lots of people would read it. I guess you'd call it a blog, right? Or something like that. A podcast or whatever. I don't know what you guys listen to. I don't know what you do. But you know what I'm talking about. And so that was shut down. So if a newspaper began to report that heavy losses of British troops, thousands die in battle, headline with a picture. No. All of that was highly screened, sanitized, if you will, censored. Censorship and propaganda were used. You probably know what censorship is, right? That means you're going to say something, write something, publish something, and you are told you can't. You are prevented from doing it somehow, right? That's censorship. Propaganda is sort of the flip side. Propaganda is where if I don't want you to say bad things, I begin to say really good things that may or may not be exactly true, and I exaggerate things to a certain point of view, and then I eliminate the other point of view so that people just hear one side, and the side they hear is exaggerated. That's propaganda. Well, you know what propaganda is, probably when you hear it, right? When you experience it, you'll know. Well, just so you don't think that England is the only one, France imposes censorship in 1917. And of course, the propaganda that's used here makes the enemy look really evil. Like I told you, there would be posters and slogans and songs that would talk about the terribleness of the enemy. So in France and England, they would talk about how terrible the Germans were. They often called them Huns. They would show a depiction, a drawing of a Hun looking bloodthirsty with a bayoneted gun, perhaps with a baby on the bayonet. This is what the Huns do. They break in and they kill babies. They rape women. They're terrible people. We have to stop them. Well, I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. They are uncivilized. They are brutal. They will not listen to reason. The only thing they will listen to is force. So we got to hit them hard. Otherwise, the implication is the Huns will be here, in France, in England, and they're going to go across the country and create a terrible time for all of us. Okay? So, here are some of the things that happen. Wages, prices, rents, frozen, propaganda, civil liberties lifted, abandoned in the name of the war effort. Now here's another big thing that happens. Women, the role for women really changes, especially in Europe. The United States, it doesn't change as much, although some, but it will with World War II, maybe more in World War I. But World War I is really the time when women get a chance to change what they're doing. Before World War I, women's roles were very prescribed. Women just didn't have certain kinds of jobs. Women didn't do certain sorts of things. They didn't wear certain kind of clothes. Go take a look at fashion of 1900 and take a look at fashion of 1920. Those of you who are into fashion, and I can see most of you are. You will see a huge difference in what clothing women are wearing. I mean, in 1900, 1890, 1900, women are wearing like they're not even showing their ankles. If you showed your ankles, you were a shameless woman, right? In 1920, they're wearing like little skirts, and they're called flappers, right? And they're going around, they're wearing little like halter top things. I don't know what you guys call them. But, you know, there's a whole lot. You can see a whole lot of the lady in 1920s. You saw almost nothing in 1890, 1900. You can see their face and their hands, and that was about it. Okay? Well, why is that going to change? It's going to change because millions of men go off to war. The women aren't going off to war. That means if we want these jobs done, we're probably going to have to get women to do it. If I own a factory and I want to only have men working in my factory, most of the men are gone, how am I going to keep my factory running? I guess I better start thinking about hiring women. So that's what happens. That's how it happens. Millions of men are at war. Well, take a look at this. Here you see the British worker woman, the factory worker woman of Britain in World War I. Notice in her right hand is a bi-wing plane. She's building the planes. Notice in her left hand is a shell. She's building munitions, ammunition, and bombs. She's working in the factories, and she is building these weapons of war. For every fighter, a woman worker. That says it pretty well. If you're going to send 1 million guys over to war, we're going to have to hire 1 million women to take their place. Of course, this is asking you to give to the YWCA so that these ladies will have a place to stay in the city, away from their families, that'll be safe and affordable. The Young Women's Christian Association, that's what YWCA stands for, by the way. To support the war effort, you should support the YWCA. Well, in England, jobs are up 1.3 million. Many of these jobs, matter of fact, most of these jobs have been held by men. And now, guess what? The men are gone. And when the men come back, I mean, many of them die in battle. When they come back, many of them are injured. Many of them are in the hospital. Many of them have lost a leg or an arm. They're not going back to their old jobs. The women are moving into those jobs. And they're doing jobs that people would have never thought that they would do before, like being a chimney sweep. Getting a woman up on the top of your house and having her sweep down the chimney, right, to get the coal dust out so you don't get a chimney fire. Truck drivers. Women truck drivers. Hadn't had those before. Factory workers of all kinds. These are the kinds of things that will begin to happen. And by the way, once these things begin to change, once women begin to have these jobs, guess what? They show that they can do them. They do the jobs as well as the men, maybe better at times. So the restrictions used to be, well, women are too weak. Women can't do this. Women can't handle it. They don't have that argument anymore because the women can say, we've done all those jobs. But when the war ends, a lot of guys come back, they give them back their jobs, and then the women lose those jobs. That creates new problems. All right, we'll end it there for now. We'll see you later.